various animal species are regularly going extinct on our planet. For us, most of this goes unnoticed, until one day we read a brief news article reporting the death of the last male of a large species, such as the northern white rhinoceros. Only then do we realize the scale of the loss. Imagine for a moment waking up to the news that elephants have completely vanished from the face of the earth. Yet, something similar has already happened in human history. You've probably guessed that we're talking about mammoths. Indeed, why did they go extinct just before our modern era? What would the world look like if they survived? Did they really look the way they are commonly portrayed today? Why did the last mammoths on the planet endure terrible suffering? But most importantly, could we actually revive the mammoth? Stay tuned, as we'll answer all of these questions today. Mammoths. Likes support videos and help the YouTube algorithm promote high-quality content. Please leave a thumbs up to support this video. Firstly, it's worth noting right away that mammoths were far more diverse than a single biological species. When we hear the word mammoths, our minds typically picture woolly giants with enormous tusks. However, in reality, these creatures varied significantly depending on their habitat and the development stage of this entire mammal genus. The sizes of individual species varied dramatically. For example, North America was fortunate enough to be the homeland for the largest species, Mammothus imperator, or the imperial mammoth. It was 16.40 feet tall and weighed 14 tons. At the other end of the spectrum were the dwarf mammoths, Mammothus exilis and Mammothus lamarmorei, who barely exceeded 6 feet in height and weighed up to 2,000 pounds. The most prevalent mammoth species were roughly the same size as today's elephants. However, they certainly differed in appearance and body structure from their modern-day cousins. Compared to elephants, mammoths had bulkier bodies, shorter legs, and long fur. Those are the most striking differences. Another distinctive feature was their large curved tusks. Modern elephants can only dream of having such huge tusks. They always steal the spotlight when it comes to mammoths. So we are going to explore this feature in more detail in a moment. On the contrary, their ears were relatively humble in size and were much smaller than those of elephants. Mammoths' ears were 5 to 6 times smaller than those of an Asian elephant, and 15 to 16 times smaller than those of an African elephant. Moreover, the ears lay flat against their skulls. Interestingly, people often overlook this feature, focusing only on the thick fur and prominent tusks. In fact, the shape of a mammoth's ear is more akin to a human ear than to an elephant's. The skeletal structure of ancient mammoths closely resembles that of the modern-day Indian elephant. The most distinctive feature is, of course, adult mammoths' gigantic tusks. They were up to about 16 feet long and weighed as much as 220 pounds. The tusks were in the upper jaw, growing forward, curving upwards, and extending outward. We'll discuss tusks in more detail shortly, as it's one of the most fascinating subjects of research. Tusks are essentially modified incisors, growing at the front of the skull and pointing upwards. Even at birth, baby mammoths already had miniature tusklets reaching a few inches long. These started to emerge from the alveoli or gums at about 6 months of age. They were barely visible on the baby's face. The baby tusks would eventually be replaced by the adult ones when the mammoths reached about 1 year old. In the first 6 to 7 years of a young mammoth's life, the tusks grew at an accelerated rate, much like the rest of their body. By the time males were 10 years old, their tusks could be 3 to 4 feet long, with a diameter of up to 4 inches. This growth subsequently tapered off, but by the time males reached 20 to 25 years of age, their tusks could measure 6 to 7 feet in length and 5 inches in diameter at the alveolus edge. Old males aged 60 to 65 years had tusks as long as 11 to 13 feet and a diameter of 6 to 7 inches at the alveolus. In females, it was 6 to 7 feet and 3 to 4 inches, respectively. Scientists can deduce some facts about the life of an adult individual by the size of the tusks and their annual rings. What? Did mammoth tusks have annual rings like trees? Surprisingly, the answer is yes. And they also can reveal some valuable information. At the very least, Scientists can accurately determine the animal's age at the time of death by counting the rings on a cross-section. Based on the size of the tusks, scientists can even determine how many offspring a female might have born, although this requires some sophisticated equipment. Interestingly, mammoth tusks generally curved upward and to the sides, with the left tusk usually growing toward the right one, and the right tusk toward the left. In other words, in adult specimens, the tusks appeared to face each other. Such positioning was usually found in males. At the base, a tusk was about 7 to 7.5 inches in diameter. Mammoths often used their tusks for essential survival tasks, like self-defense or digging through snow in search of food. As a result, examinations of tusk specimens have revealed cracks and chips, as well as signs of wear and tear on the outer edge. Given how massive the tusks were, one might wonder how they were attached to the skull and how their base could fit into it. In this regard, they actually have a lot in common with modern elephants. The mammoth's nostrils were positioned high on the forehead, approximately at eye level, resembling the structure of a whale's skull. The brain was nested deep beneath the frontal sinuses, extending inwards up to 12 to 13 inches. This design provided ample space for securely anchoring the tusks. Mammoth tusks are still regularly found to this day. Millennia spent underground have often led to fascinating mineralization processes, imbuing the tusks with various shading rings from light brown to emerald, blue, purple, and even black. While fossils and bones are truly captivating, what's even more intriguing is how mammoths actually looked. Since childhood, we've seen numerous images of ancient humans hunting mammoths. But was this really like that? Or are we heading for a big surprise, much like with our understanding of how dinosaurs looked? Who would have thought that most dinosaurs were feathered creatures and looked more like chickens than reptiles? Indeed, reconstructing the appearance of extinct animals is often very challenging. In most cases, only bones are preserved in fossilized form. They allow us to reconstruct animals' sizes, proportions, and even lifestyles. But they offer no clues about coloration, fur length, or the shape and position of softer external organs like ears, noses, or even more so, trunks. Even rhino horns made of keratin are preserved only under unique conditions. Luckily, mammoths have left us a few extra clues. Fragments of skin or even mummified bodies have been occasionally preserved in permafrost, oil pools, and sometimes caves. These have provided a remarkably detailed picture of what mammoths actually looked like. So we now know for certain that mammoths had, unsurprisingly, massive column-like legs and round feet. The foot diameter varied, ranging from 5 to 6 inches in 1-year-old calves to 18 to 20 inches in older males. They had 3, rarely 4, nail-shaped hooves in the front and rear legs. The hooves were 3 to 4 inches long and 1.37 to 1.57 inches high. The soles of their feet were exceptionally sturdy, over 2 inches thick. Much like modern elephants, the mammoths had feet equipped with elastic cushions of connective tissue that acted as shock absorbers. When the load increased, they expanded the support area, and when it decreased, they reduced it, thus helping to move on thawing, over-moistened soils. The next point is, of course, the fur. Here, too, the scientists were lucky enough to find some well-preserved samples. There are many finds that allow us to restore the features of the mammoth's fur. In the most common mammoth species, it was light brown or yellowish brown. The fur on the flanks almost reached the ground, resembling a skirt. The animal's head featured a fringe-like headpiece of stiff, tangled hair, 6 to 6.7 inches long. It covered the animal's crown, descending to the eyes and the base of the trunk. Most importantly, mammoth's fur was thick, dense, and had 3 layers. The stiffest guard layer, or overhair, was on top, followed by awn hairs, and finally undercoat, or downy hairs. As quite obvious, these prehistoric inhabitants of the far north had a very warm coat. In general, we must admit that all these numerous paintings, illustrations, and reconstructions are visually accurate. Mammoths looked exactly like that. Finally, after numerous comparisons between mammoths and elephants, it's time to answer the most pressing questions. How do our modern elephants relate to mammoths? Are they descendants of these furry giants? Or are they just relatives? Elephas primigenius is the Latin name for one of the mammoth species. Even the name indicates its close relationship with elephants because it's literally translated as firstborn elephant. Indeed, there have been some hypotheses suggesting that The mammoth is the ancestor of the modern elephant, which is the result of evolution and adaptation to a warm climate. Many lay people believe that mammoths are the actual ancestors of modern elephants. However, the truth is far more complex and captivating. The closest living relative of the mammoth is the Indian elephant. Both share a common ancestor, tracing their genealogical tree back to at least 5.5 million years ago. This is the age of the oldest remains of Primelophes camphotheroids, the oldest and most primitive elephant family species, with extremely rare specimens. Quite fittingly, it's called the first elephant, and it lived in Africa. So if anyone insists that mammoths are the ancestors of African elephants, you can easily prove that it's actually quite the opposite. From an evolutionary standpoint, the woolly mammoth was one of the most successful Pleistocene animal species, originating about 800,000 years ago in Eastern Asia, where its ancestor, the steppe mammoth, lived. This species spread over a vast territory, and now its remains are found from Spain to Chukotka and from Alaska to southern Canada. Thanks to the fact that these animals were drawn to the northern habitats, many of their carcasses were preserved in permafrost conditions. This allowed scientists to literally study these animals from the tip of the trunk to the tip of the tail. With abundantly preserved remains, as well as the ancient wall paintings depicting mammoths, scientists have a good idea not only of how these prehistoric giants looked, but even their way of life. And there is a lot to talk about, because mammoths were relatively long-lived. On average, they lived for 60 years, which is an impressive lifespan by animal standards. So what did these giants do during their life? How long did it take for them to grow up? How did they reproduce? What hardships did they face? Stay tuned, as you will now learn the most fascinating facts about these creatures. First, let's talk about the diet. The mammoth was a dedicated vegetarian. Its main diet consisted of herbaceous plants, tree shoots, small shrubs, and moss. But when it comes to their daily consumption rate, the word impressive barely scratches the surface. A staggering 550 pounds of plant matter was needed simply to sustain the mammoth. This required them to spend about 18 hours a day foraging, constantly changing their location in search of fresh pastures. The animal's diet included rough food, which can be inferred from its dental structures. Despite their enormous size, mammoths had only a couple of molar teeth, which helped them grind plant matter. Much like modern elephants, the mammoth had only one, but a very large tooth, on each side of the upper and lower jaws. During the tooth change period, there were two of them. The mammoth tooth had quite a unique structure. It resembled a grater, composed of separate enamel-coated plates. Such a tool allowed for coping with the roughest plant food. What was also surprising is that over the course of their lifetime, each half of the mammoth's jaw would cycle through 6 teeth, the first 3 being milk teeth, and the last 3 being permanent root teeth. The last root tooth weighed up to 3 to 4 kilograms. The herbivorous nature of mammoths largely determined their behavior and social aspects. Mammoths generally lived in herds, a typical evolutionary adaptation that helps herbivores protect themselves from predators and collectively solve feeding issues. Based on a massive body of fossil evidence, scientists have determined that these herds were often led by a matriarch, usually an older female. While males contributed to the herd's defense, they mostly lived separately. Young males formed subgroups and stayed in smaller herds. Each of the subgroups was headed by the dominant male, although it remained under the overarching authority of the matriarch. She was the one who guided the herd and set its course, followed by all herd members. Within the herd, a deep sense of kinship prevailed. Adult females, held in high regard by their peers, often looked after the young of others. These small groups moved around in search of food. During seasonal migrations, these groups would come together to form a larger herd and consume all the vegetation they found along the way. Overall, the life of a mammoth was an endless feast and an equally endless quest for new grazing lands. Unlike many other mammals, mammoth calves took a long time to become fully independent. They reached sexual maturity at around 10 years of age. At this point, there were some significant changes in their lives and behavior. And this brings us to the fascinating subject of mammoth reproduction. An international group of scientists recently studied the right tusk of a male mammoth who lived approximately 35,000 years ago. They discovered evidence of sharp seasonal surges in testosterone levels. Similar events occur in the lives of modern elephants. This happens during a period known as musth, a phase marked by dangerous behavior in young male elephants. Musth refers to a specific state a male elephant experiences during the mating season. During this period, a surge in testosterone levels triggers drastic behavioral changes. A wild male elephant in Musth regularly emits a unique low-frequency sound that can be heard by elephants of both sexes tens of kilometers away. This sound attracts some females who trumpet as they rush towards him. Conversely, males not in Musth, as well as uninterested females, tend to avoid such sounds. This may be because male elephants in Musth are quite dangerous. For instance, they may attack human villages, damage property, or even kill rhinos. Recent research suggests that mammoths also experienced Musth. This had significant implications for their interactions with other species that lived at the time, including even humans, who, in all likelihood, didn't like their giant neighbors. If the roar of a modern elephant can be heard for dozens of miles, one could only imagine the sound an imperial mammoth could make. According to the study published in Nature, scientists used liquid chromatography and tandem mass spectrometry to measure testosterone concentrations in the tusks of a male mammoth aged 33 to 38 and a modern male African elephant. It turned out that both species exhibit striking annual spikes in testosterone levels throughout their adult lives. However, their intensity was different. During the spikes, elephants' testosterone levels increased by 20 times compared to a 10-time increase in mammoths. Researchers attribute this variance to the degradation of testosterone in the preserved tusk over tens of thousands of years since the death of the male mammoth. Nevertheless, even tenfold spikes in testosterone levels are enough. They directly suggest that male mammoths went through Musth. At the same time, a test conducted on a tusk from a female mammoth that lived on Wrangel Island 5,500 to 6,000 years ago showed no such spikes in testosterone. In other words, female mammoths did not experience Musth, and neither do modern female elephants. Nowadays, domestic male elephants in Musth are typically restrained with deeply embedded male stakes to prevent destruction. In the case of wild male African elephants, it is necessary to ensure that there are older males in the herd near the younger ones. These older males tend to mitigate the violent tendencies of the younger ones in Musth, which prevents them from killing rhinos and other destructive behavior. It's quite possible that older individuals also exerted such an influence on young mammoths. Overall, mammoths lived in a rather favorable ecological niche. This is evidenced by the fact that they managed to populate most of the northern part of our planet. Mammoths thrived for hundreds of thousands and even millions of years. But why aren't we now making exciting documentaries about these amazing creatures, instead of studying their fossilized remains? What really happened? How and why did the mammoths go extinct? Even when it comes to dinosaur extinction theories, where it would be easier to pin everything on the asteroid, there's no consensus among scientists as to the most defining factor. Likewise, we can't identify a single cause for the mammoth's extinction, especially considering the fact that the last populations only died out about 4,000 years ago. This is merely a blink of an eye by evolutionary standards. The Egyptian pyramids had already been standing for 500 years by then. So what prevented mammoths from surviving to the present day? After all, there were no ice ages or any sort of global disasters that could have wiped out an entire species. In reality, the extinction of mammoths was due to multiple factors and occurred in several stages. Naturally, the last stage was the most tragic. Stay tuned to discover the terrible suffering these animals had to endure before eventually vanishing from Earth. Consider the following image. A group of mammoths is attempting to fend off a polar bear. However, something about this scene seems out of proportion, doesn't it? Look at the sizes of the mammoths and the bear. It appears as if the mammoth family has stumbled upon some gigantic predator, a polar bear the size of a mammoth. In fact, what happened here was quite the opposite. The bear in the picture is of modern size, while the mammoths are mere dwarfs. They stood only 2 heads taller than a modern human, and weighed no more than 3 tons, contrasting sharply with the standard 6 to 8 ton weight of a male mammoth. Such a scene could have occurred just about 4,000 years ago on Wrangel Island, the last refuge of mammoths on the planet. Soon after such hypothetical encounters, the mammoths vanished completely. But what led to their ultimate demise? The peak of the mammoth extinction was just a small part of the mass extinction of large mammals during the Quaternary period. This period coincided with the end of the last ice age, approximately 15,000 years ago. Roughly 5,000 years later, mammoths had almost entirely vanished. There were some extremely small populations, but they too had no chance of surviving due to the unfortunate and unforeseeable reasons which we'll explore in a moment. The primary reason cited for the downfall of these woolly giants is climate change, which drastically reduced mammoth-friendly habitats. The extinction of mammoths was not sudden. It took thousands of years and occurred unevenly across their vast geographic range. For example, the last Spanish mammoth lived almost 19,000 years ago. Mammoths disappeared from Great Britain about 12,000 years ago, and the last mainland mammoth population on Earth, living in northern Chukotka, ceased to exist about 9,000 years ago. Tiny mammoth populations remained on isolated islands. For example, on St. Paul Island off the coast of Alaska, mammoths lived up to 5,600 years ago. The last mammoths on Earth roamed the shores of Wrangel Island about 4,000 years ago. They lived until the rise of the earliest human civilizations and the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza in ancient Egypt. Following the end of the Ice Age, rising sea levels severed the mammoth's connection to the mainland. This isolation led to a reduction in mammoth sizes. The phenomenon of island dwarfism is well documented in both modern animals and the paleontological record. It serves as a classic example of how populations adapt to limited resources. In the long term, it's easier for evolution to shrink an individual's body size than to find new food sources for it. Thus, the mammoth became smaller. However, dwarfism was not the most severe consequence of isolation, nor were the harsh winds that prevented the transition from open tundra to forested landscapes. Even humans were inculpable as they first arrived on the island about 3,000 years ago. The actual cause was different. The small area of the island, which was almost 3 square miles, couldn't support a large population of big animals. There simply couldn't be many of them. Limited space led to severe inbreeding with this isolated community. As a result of prolonged inbreeding, the already tiny population of around 300 Wrangel Island mammoths suffered significant losses in genetic diversity. Harmful mutations began to accumulate. According to genetic sequencing results, the local mammoths had many more deletions or instances of DNA damage compared to their mainland cousins. A whole set of genes, including those related to olfactory receptors and urinary proteins, became essentially non-functional. For example, some typical mutations were observed in gene FOXQ1 of island mammoths. In laboratory mice, they led to the formation of thin, translucent hairs and the disrupted secretion of some gastrointestinal tract substances. If the FOXQ1 gene mutation had similar effects in mammoths, it would mean that the animals not only suffered from digestive issues, but also had less dense and coarser fur. It would have provided less insulation against harsh Arctic winds. The fur could quickly become wet under the snow, potentially leading to hypothermia-induced death. But all of this is just a fraction of the terrible consequences that accumulated and manifested with each successive generation. Further research into the mutated genes of Wrangel Island mammoths revealed even more destructive effects of prolonged isolation. By restoring mammoth DNA fragments in the genomes of laboratory animals, scientists discovered serious abnormalities in genes associated with developmental defects: HYLS1, low sperm count in seminal fluid, reduced male fertility, NKD1, and even diabetes, neuro-G3. It's quite likely that the mammoths on Wrangel Island were doomed from the moment they became isolated. The reason is that the minimum population size needed to maintain genetic diversity is generally considered to be 500 individuals. For Asian elephants, the woolly mammoth's closest modern relatives, a viable population is considered to be between 216 and 4,700 individuals. This means the Wrangel Island mammoth population was dangerously close to the extinction threshold. Due to reduced genetic diversity, harmful mutations became fixed in the genome, and sooner or later, this led to complete mutational degeneration. Unfortunately, it's impossible to say for sure today whether the mutational crisis was the primary factor in the eventual extinction of the mammoths. Some researchers believe that the collapse of the Wrangel Island population could have been caused by catastrophic events, or hunting by ancient humans, whose arrival on the island roughly coincides with the extinction of mammoths. The latter possibility brings to mind the iconic image of Neanderthals driving mammoths into traps. This has become such an ingrained stereotype that many people are convinced that humans were the primary cause of the mammoth's demise. However, the reality is much more complicated. Some artifacts made from tusks and skins, frequently discovered at ancient human settlement sites, support the theory of human influence on mammoth extinction. However, modern research increasingly challenges this assumption. According to some scientists, humans primarily hunted down weakened and sick individuals rather than healthy ones. Given the animal's thick, hard skin and triple-layered fur, the primitive weapons of the time would have been ill-suited for such formidable prey. Additionally, indirect evidence suggests that mammoth meat was stringy and exceptionally tough, hardly suitable for consumption. The definitive conclusion on this issue was given by an international research team led by Eske Willerslev, a professor at St. John's College, University of Cambridge, and the director of the Center for Geogenetics at the University of Copenhagen. The research group spent a whole decade conducting extensive research in woolly mammoth habitats. Their findings definitively show that a radical shift in climate, rather than human activity, was the primary driver of their extinction. At the end of the Ice Age, many glaciers melted due to warming. The environment became too wet and marshy for these giant creatures. Additionally, the vegetation that had sustained mammoths throughout the Pleistocene epoch disappeared. Genetic research findings were also published in Nature. Scientists sequenced the DNA of plant and animal remains from the mammoth era, including urine, feces, and skin cells from soil samples that were meticulously collected in Arctic regions over a span of 20 years. Advanced technology allows the recreation of ancient DNA profiles based on the diverse collected genetic material. As part of the project, the DNA from 1,500 previously unstudied Arctic plants was sequenced for the first time. Scientists have argued for 100 years about why mammoths went extinct, said Willerslev. Humans have been blamed because the animals had survived for millions of years without climate change killing them off before. But when they lived alongside humans, they didn't last long. We were accused of hunting them to death. And we should remember that there were a lot of animals around that were easier to hunt than a giant woolly mammoth. They could grow to the height of a double-decker bus. According to scientific models, humans had no significant impact on the extinction of mammoths. The real factors are now believed to be climate changes and, specifically, altered precipitation patterns, leading to changes in vegetation and the loss of the unique polar tundra steppe. Lakes, rivers, and swamps emerged when the climate became more humid and glaciers started melting. The reduced plant biomass of this transformed ecosystem could no longer support the mammoth populations. We don't know exactly when the last mammoth died. However, judging by the dismal health condition of the last population on Wrangel Island, the last mammoth on Earth could have been a juvenile. Interestingly, the most well-preserved remains often come from young animals. This brings us to some of the most striking discoveries that have shaken the scientific community and become a global sensation. Most mammoth remains were discovered in Russian Siberia, simply because it was their largest habitat. The permafrost of Siberia, as well as similar climactic zones in Canada, have yielded more than just skeletal remains, but several mummified carcasses of young mammoths. Just recently, in 2022, an astonishingly well-preserved mammoth calf mummy was discovered in northern Canada. It was named Nunchauga, meaning big animal baby, in the Han language, spoken by the indigenous people of the region. It is now the most complete mammoth mummy ever discovered in North America. Nunchauga died and was preserved in the permafrost during the Ice Age over 30,000 years ago. The discovery was made by geologists thanks to a young miner at the Klondike gold mines who stumbled upon the remains while excavating manure. Paleontologists now joke that the most significant discovery in North America paleontology was made by a miner digging through manure. According to the official Yukon government website, it's likely that the young mammoth became separated from its mother and got stuck in the mud it couldn't escape from and perished. Despite these tragic circumstances, Nunchauga's death has been a real gift for scientists. The state of preservation is exceptional, right down to the hooves of its toes and the intestinal contents. Based on the size of the calf, it appears to have died at a very young age, just about a month old. Earlier, another young mammoth calf named Lyuba was discovered in Russia in 2007. Let's now explore the details surrounding Lyuba's discovery and what it was like. In May 2007, a reindeer herder discovered an astonishingly well-preserved frozen mammoth calf on the Yamal Peninsula near the upper reaches of the Uribe River. The skin, trunk, and all other body parts were absolutely intact. The calf, named Lyuba in honor of the herder's wife, became a real gift for mammoth experts worldwide. According to experts, the mammoth calf was female and died at about 1 month of age, approximately 42,000 years ago. Its torso measured 3 by 4.26 feet and weighed 66 pounds. Numerous studies by specialists from Russia, Japan, the US, France, and the Netherlands confirmed that the mammoth calf didn't suffer from any diseases or malnutrition during its life. On the contrary, it had a pronounced hump of fat reserves and intact skeletal bones. However, its oral cavity and respiratory tracts were filled with silt and mud, suggesting she died after falling into a water body and inhaling sediment. Though only a month old and still nursing from her mother, Lyuba's intestines also contained seeds, pollen, spores, and plant remains, which helped identify the nature of the water body as lightly marshy, as well as the terrain as a tundra-like landscape. For the first time, a somewhat unsettling discovery was made thanks to the study of Lyuba's stomach and intestinal contents. Like modern elephants, young mammoths consume their mother's feces to create the right bacterial environment in their digestive systems. Also, for the first time, scientists confirmed that shortly after birth, and possibly even in utero, mammoths develop a pronounced neck hump with brown fat reserves, which served as a thermoregulator. According to scientists, Lyuba, the baby mammoth, belonged to the branch of mammoths that migrated to North America along the existing land bridge before eventually returning. Interestingly, Lyuba was the second completely preserved mammoth ever discovered. So, who was the first? Let's find out. In the distant year of 1977, the world of archaeology was shaken by an unprecedented discovery. A team of gold miners accidentally discovered a mummified animal in the USSR, in the Magadan region near the Dima stream in the Kirgiliak River Valley. While excavating a potential gold deposit, a bulldozer operator unearthed an unusual brownish-red object. Upon closer inspection of the find, it became evident that he had stumbled upon a unique animal carcass. Scientists were promptly notified and arrived as soon as they could. Almost immediately, it turned into a global sensation. For the first time in the history of science, a fully preserved mammoth body had been discovered. Further study revealed that the baby mammoth was a malnutritious male nearing weaning age. Its shoulder height was about 3 feet. The carcass weighed about 154 pounds. Taking into account the moisture loss from freezing, its estimated live weight could have been as much as 220 pounds. Initially, the find was covered in fur, but most of it had been lost. Unfortunately, the carcass had not been handled very carefully before the scientists arrived. Without its fur, the animal appeared to have long legs, but the hind limbs were noticeably shorter than the front. The first amateur photographs showed that long fur covered the legs from the knees to the soles of the feet. There was also fur on the left cheek and trunk, left side, and shoulder. Unfortunately, by the time the specimen arrived at the regional center, only isolated strands of hair remained. According to witnesses, much of the fur was taken by souvenir hunters in the early days. About 3 pounds of fur was collected by scientists from the soil at the site, where the baby mammoth was found. Scientists calculated that the young mammoth died in August or September, and was only 6 to 7 months old at that time. The well-developed fur coat indicates that the animal had quickly grown its fur during the brief summer to withstand the harsh winter. Unfortunately, it wasn't destined to survive even its first winter, and thousands of years later, the same fate would befall all of its kind. Which leaves us wondering, what would the world be like if mammoths hadn't gone extinct? What would happen if they had continued to live among us? Our initial answer to this question may disappoint many. Nothing. Absolutely nothing special would have happened. Most people would hardly be in awe of these animals. We would likely take their existence for granted. At first, people would most definitely hunt them for their tough but edible meat, durable hides, and valuable tusks. Then, realizing its mistake, humanity would shift towards conserving mammoths. But this wouldn't stop poachers, just as the protected status of white rhinos hasn't stopped them before. On March 19, 2018, a male northern white rhinoceros named Sudan was euthanized due to severe illness. He was the last male northern white rhino on Earth. As harsh as it sounds, it's plausible that mammoths could have faced a similar fate. In view of the depressing trend of species extinction and concurrent advances in genetic engineering, many people ask a tentative question. Could mammoths possibly be resurrected? For example, through cloning. After all, we do have some preserved bodies. Well, that's an intriguing question, and we already have the answer for you. Indeed, this thought has crossed the minds of both sci-fi enthusiasts and famous scientists. However, the process isn't as straightforward as it might seem to the layperson. The fact is, extracting viable genetic information from a body that has lain in permafrost for tens of thousands of years is virtually impossible, at least with the current level of knowledge and technological limitations. With this being said, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. Some efforts are underway to explore this possibility. For instance, scientists were quite excited to find another well-preserved mammoth named Yucca that was discovered in Yucatilla, Russia. In the course of their research, Russian and Japanese molecular biologists managed to extract nuclei from Yucca's cells and implant them into mouse ova. Unfortunately, they weren't able to fully revive them. The results of the experiments seeking to resurrect the mammoth's genetic legacy were published in Nature. 5 of the cells we obtained showed signals of activity that are typically seen just before cell division. On the other hand, none of them were able to initiate division, which is essential for mammoth revival. In my opinion, we are still far from solving this problem, stated Kiai Miyamoto from Kindai University in Wakayama, Japan. So far, there have been multiple unsuccessful attempts to recover the mammoth's genetic code. For now, we cannot clone or otherwise de-extinct mammoths, but our chances can be much higher in the near future.